senators, and representatives, I have the distinguished honor of presenting.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Mr. Hutchings History. In today's episode, we'll explore the term Jim Crow and its deep connection to racial segregation in the United States, focusing on its origins, legal underpinnings, and the lasting impact of Jim Crow laws on African Americans. By the time these laws were dismantled in the 1960s, the laws left a profound legacy of inequality and racial injustice in the American South and beyond. Etymology, the origin of Jim Crow. The term Jim Crow finds its roots in a degrading caricature of African Americans popularized by the white minstrel performer Thomas D. Rice in the 1820s. Rice's Jump Jim Crow was a song and dance routine performed in blackface intended to mock and stereotype black people. The derogatory nature of the character quickly spread, and by the 1830s, Jim Crow had become a pejorative term synonymous with African Americans. This racist trope would later be institutionalized in the laws that bore its name. The phrase Jim Crow law first appeared in print in 1884 during debates in the U.S. Congress over racial segregation. By the late 19th century, Jim Crow had become the common label for laws that enforced segregation across the southern United States, symbolizing the systematic oppression of Black Americans. The rise of Jim Crow laws, reversing Reconstruction gains. Following the end of the Civil War, 1861-1865, African Americans experienced a brief period of political and social empowerment during Reconstruction. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery, granted citizenship to former slaves, and secured voting rights for Black men, not women. However, these gains were short-lived. By the 1870s, as Reconstruction collapsed, Southern states were enacting Jim Crow laws to undo these advancements. White-dominated state legislatures systematically disenfranchised Black voters and imposed racial segregation in public facilities, transportation, and schools. The goal was clear: to reassert white supremacy and deny African Americans the social, economic, and political progress they had briefly enjoyed. The legal backbone. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, U.S. Supreme Court decision. The formalization of Jim Crow laws came with the Supreme Court's infamous decision in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. In this case, Homer Plessy, an African American man, challenged Louisiana's segregated train car law by refusing to sit in a colored car. The Supreme Court ruled against Plessy, establishing the separate but equal doctrine, which allowed racial segregation as long as ostensibly equal facilities were provided for both whites and blacks. In practice, however, the separate facilities were rarely, if ever, equal. Schools for Black children were severely underfunded. Transportation and public services for African Americans were inadequate, and Black citizens were denied basic access to restaurants, hotels, and other public spaces. The Plessy decision entrenched the legal framework that justified the oppressive social and political order of the Jim Crow South. Segregation beyond the South. Although Jim Crow laws are most closely associated with the South, discriminatory practices were not confined to this region. Northern and Western states often participated and practiced de facto segregation in housing, employment, and schools, even without formal laws. For example, Black Americans were commonly excluded from voting through discriminatory practices like poll taxes, literacy tests, and the grandfather clauses, all of which were used to disenfranchise them as African Americans across the United States. Moreover, racial segregation in the military and federal institutions persisted, as did widespread discrimination in private businesses and real estate. Thus, the legacy of Jim Crow was not just a Southern phenomenon, but a national issue affecting African Americans' lives across the entire United States. Resistance to Jim Crow, the NAACP, and the fight for civil rights. From the earliest days of Jim Crow, African Americans resisted segregation. The founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, in 1909 marked a crucial turning point in the fight against legalized racism. The NAACP focused on legal challenges to Jim Crow, spearheaded by attorneys like Thurgood Marshall, who would later win the historic Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954. This case overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and ruled that segregated public schools were inherently unequal, marking a critical victory in the long battle against segregation. Civil rights activism also took the form of direct protest, such as boycotts, sit-ins, and marches. The Montgomery bus boycott, 1955 to 1956, led by figures like Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., demonstrated the power of mass nonviolent resistance. The boycott succeeded in ending segregation on public buses in Montgomery, Alabama, and became a model for future civil rights campaigns across the South.
This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like CastBox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Jim Crow's legacy and the end of legal segregation. The dismantling of Jim Crow laws came slowly. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, were landmark pieces of legislation that finally outlawed racial segregation and disenfranchisement. Yet the effects of Jim Crow continued to reverberate long after these laws were passed. African Americans remained economically disadvantaged, politically marginalized, and socially stigmatized due to decades of enforced inequality. Today, the legacy of Jim Crow can still be felt in issues such as mass incarceration, voter suppression tactics, and systemic racial disparities in education and housing. While the legal framework of segregation has been dismantled, the social and economic inequalities that Jim Crow created have proven harder to erase. Understanding Jim Crow today. Jim Crow was more than a set of laws. It was a system designed to uphold white supremacy and institutionalize racism. From the 1870s to the 1960s, it shaped every aspect of life for African Americans in the South and beyond, reinforcing second-class citizenship and economic disenfranchisement. Understanding Jim Crow is crucial not only for understanding American history, but also for grappling with long-lasting effects of racial inequality in the present. As we reflect on the struggles of the civil rights movement and the individuals and organizations that fought against segregation, we must also acknowledge the enduring legacy of Jim Crow. Its impact on American society continues to influence debates on racial justice, equality, and civil rights. That's this episode for Mr. Hutchings History today. If you found this episode interesting or useful to you, may I ask you to like, subscribe, and share this episode with others who might also be interested in learning. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.